Hello, welcome back to Mobility Field Day Live with Aruba. We are here with our group of influencers in the wireless community to discuss some of the topics that we heard about today during Mobility Field Day Live. We're very excited to discuss the technology and the applications and those kinds of things that are important to the folks that are listening and watching this at home. My name is Tom Hollingsworth. I am an organizer on the Tech Field Day event series, and I'm very happy to be bringing this to you today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the delegates that we have at our event, starting with Richard McIntosh.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard McIntosh. I'm a network engineer, and you can find me on Twitter at 802TopHat or on my blog at 802tophat.wordpress.com.
Hi, I'm Jake Snyder. I'm a wireless network engineer. And you can find me on Twitter at jsnyder81 or on my blog, transmitfailure.blogspot.com.
I'm Scott McDermott. I'm a network engineer. I blog at mostlynetworks.com, and you can follow me on Twitter as @ScottM32768.
My name is Sean Neal. I'm a mobility architect. My Twitter is SV_Neal, or you can reach me on my blog at blog.svneal.com.
I'm Ryan Adsma. I'm a wireless engineer. You can find me on Twitter at radsma or my blog, techevangelist.net.
I'm Joshua Williams. I'm a mobility architect and solution strategist from Oklahoma. My presence on Twitter is at 802.me, D-O-T-E-M-E, and my blog is at 802.me, spelling out the 8, E-I-G-H-T, 02.me.
Hello there, my name is George Stefanik. I'm a wireless architect. You can find me on my blog, my80211.com, or on Twitter at wirelessguru with 3 S's.
Hi, my name is Roel Dionisio. I'm a network engineer. You can find me on Twitter at Roel Dionisio. Good luck spelling it. And my blog is packet6.com.
Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. First thing I want to start off by talking about is Aruba's big software release that we discussed today, ArubaOS 8. A lot of great, interesting things that are there. Some great technology advances going forward. One of which that I want to talk about is the new virtualized controllers. A lot of people were really excited for this because now we can install a controller software in some kind of virtual machine, which means it's portable, it can go to the cloud, it can be on premises. Who has some thoughts about the virtualized controllers that they'd like to share with the group? Ryan Adsma.
I mean, virtual controllers aren't new, but the fact that these are full or 99.9% feature parity is huge. It's always been a challenge when you have networking devices that are on an x86 platform, you're not able to get the same performance. And, you know, that's acknowledged, but worked around. You know, you're not going to get the same data throughput, but by clustering, by using multiple controllers, distributing the load, with, you know, some of the other features of OS 8, you can really spread that and make up for it and potentially run everything virtualized, which is amazing. It makes your wireless environment highly, highly agile.
So let me ask you this question. A lot of folks out there are looking to do large network function virtualization deployments. They're trying to get rid of as many of their old physical boxes, whether they be servers or network devices, as they can. Do you see OS 8.0 being a draw for those kinds of environments where they say, you know what, I don't have to buy a box anymore. I can just run copies of the software where I need it, so I want to standardize on this platform? Or do you think that that's going to be something that would just be nice to have for them?
I think that we're definitely headed in that direction where we're going to be able to basically just have servers that perform all the functions except actually transmitting the RF. There's, you know, other than the performance hit that you take by moving to a non-dedicated hardware platform, there's really no downside to it.
I would argue that point. I mean, everything's going virtualized for the most part, right? I mean, this is no big surprise. But I think what happens is when you enter that virtual world, A lot of times, a lot of those things are outside of your control, right? You're going to a different department who has to spin up the server, get the configuration, right? There's different components to that. And as that thing starts to grow, who knows what happens, right? Do they give you enough resources? And I say that from experience. We've all been there, I think, at some point in time. I think the concept's great. It's not a new concept, but I think the concept overall is great, especially for small branch deployments. Agile, easy to spin up, especially once you have your image going, just start replicating it.
Well, I think that's a whole nother argument of siloing within an organization.
Oh, sure, but every organization has that to some
extent. There is, yeah, and there are organizations that get around that. So if you're in one that wants to really spread out and virtualize, they've probably figured that out on the wired side, the route, the switch, all of that. So it's not going to be for everyone, but for the organizations where they kind of meld everyone into one pot and everyone kind of specializes a little bit, it may fit really, really nicely into that.
Well, and I think that the zero-touch provisioning kind of comes down to that, Mike Albano talks about the amount of sites and square footage that his company is rolling out every week. That's huge. Can you imagine being able to plug in a box, deploy your firewall, your router, your wireless LAN controller, all those things, just plug that box in, start plugging the downstream switches in, all being auto-configured. Let us go back to deploying RF and designing that piece of it instead of worrying about going to each site and turning everything up and doing the plumbing. I mean, it's more than just wireless controllers. It's the whole network layer that we're deploying. I think that's that flexibility of having it all virtualized and not sacrificing, all of these cool things that I want to do because I'm picking a virtual platform.
So I have a point there. So Jake, you work for a service provider. So you manage a lot of different networks from that perspective. So code updates for you are a huge pain because I have to go touch 47 sites. With someone like Roel, how many sites do you have to manage?
Just one big site.
Just one big site. So maybe the ability for him to not go touch boxes is less impactful. But what do you see about the virtualized controllers? How do you think that's going to help your environment?
The one thing that I find most interesting is the flexibility of the operating system, and more so focusing towards the end user experience. So you're not just tying in the technology, but you also want to make sure that the end users are using or are expecting the Wi-Fi to be there for them and to make it work for them. And you could see that with the new OS.
Interesting.
I'll add to the flexibility piece. I think there are additional elements to that are going to be really beneficial that we haven't really had in a true mobility controller up until this point, not just with Aruba, but with very many other manufacturers as well. And that's when you have it on a virtual machine, it affords you the ability to do some things like, dump your production environment into a test environment and instantly test new code, firmware revisions, and things like that, and have almost zero impact to your end user environment. I think that's going to be really spectacular.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I think, as I look at this, there was an important point made that this is kind of a foundation that's starting the next 10 years of wireless, right? So I think some of the parts we talk about, companies that maybe are still siloed, I think maybe they're later on the curve than some who are more advanced, right? But I think just enabling the customer to consume these services in the way that they, fits them, and that flexibility is really an important thing, right? And I think what interests me about the whole thing is that a lot of those services are getting moved up to the mobility master and killing sort of the original master controller model, right, where I had to have dedicated hardware that wasn't doing much. To me, I think that opens up some doors for a lot of new features.
Actually, one of those features that we now have, thanks to a little bit of controller virtualization that I want to take a moment to talk about, is Multizone. The idea that you can have multiple controllers managing the same set of access points and essentially slicing off parts of your network. And, I know Josh works for a managed service provider, so, maybe having the ability to manage a guest network for retail, or, for someone like George, having a provider that can manage a section of your wireless network for these devices Is that a draw for you guys to have the ability to say, okay, now I can finally trust that you're not going to blow up my main controller because, oh, well, we always flick that switch?
I think especially in some of the higher demand environments like hospitals, healthcare, things like that, that's going to offer some peace of mind as well as flexibility all in the same package that we haven't really had before. I've got one particular client that's been anticipating the 8.0 release for that very reason, a large hospital in Southwest Oklahoma. So.
In healthcare, we're very restrict when we look at code releases. In some cases, we might be a little behind the curve, or in some customers, way behind the curve, because we're more about reliability. When you start to look at branching over into the newer code, you obviously have to test it. And to your point, it's a great one when you spin up that virtual controller, kind of feed in your configuration, go through the basic test, make sure everything works out fine. But I really like that ability to have that cluster.
Awesome. Ryan, did you have some thoughts here on Multizone?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it's, they're talking healthcare, enterprise. I see it's definitely going to help managed service providers, but what about places where it's not your typical MSP? It's more of a retail environment, a mall. Mm-hmm. I'll stop the stores from putting all their own access points in an airport. Stop the stores from putting all their access points in. Every airline doesn't need its own wireless network. You can provide that. You can direct the traffic where you want.
That's a great point. And, I've got some other customers as well that have been really angling for a way to do multi-tenancy and figure out a way to do that securely and do it the right way. And I think that even I think there's also an incredible opportunity out there in multi-tenant residential Wi-Fi that's been a huge problem for a long time. The way that we've done residential Wi-Fi and large apartment buildings and things like this for so many years is you just bring in internet, whether it's DSL or cable, to every unit and let people do their own thing, and nothing works properly. I mean, it's just an RF nightmare. And now we're starting to see opportunities to have the management company bring in not just bandwidth, but bring in Wi-Fi and manage that throughout the facility and offer up, segregated Wi-Fi networks for every one of their tenants that can be used throughout the property seamlessly and roam from AP to AP, but do that in a way that keeps their traffic private and separate from everybody else's.
Yeah. Now, I can tell you after speaking to the product managers on this particular product, the big excitement when the launch was around retail. For a variety of reasons, retail starting to see a lot more managed service providers operating guest networks, but also that big compliance nightmare of what happens when my credit card data hits the wrong network and I have an audit trail that I have to justify now. So that's definitely something that that people have to be aware of. As much as we'd all like to believe that everybody's network looks like ours, I think the reality, especially for those of us who are service providers, no network looks the same. What about other features of OS 8.0? What was one feature of OS 8.0 that just jumped right out at you and said, I want to run back home and install this code right now?
In-service software upgrade.
Oh, now, Jake, why is in-service software upgrade such a huge thing for you?
Because it's an operational thing. It's like every time I got to take down the wireless, it impacts users. And so being able to upgrade pieces of that I may need ASAP without having to go through that impact, it's a huge deal, And, like my company, our owner's house is one of the offices. And so, yes, I'd love not to take down all of his, smart TVs and things like that when I upgrade the wireless LAN controller. So those are things that it becomes an operational hassle. It becomes, it impacts business. To be able to take down those whenever you want. I mean, in a hospital, how many change windows do you get? Not many. Yeah. And so part of that is just being able to effectively run the wireless network without having to take a lot of downtime and still get some of the benefit out of new client match profiles and that type of stuff.
Interesting.
I was just thinking, you reminded me when you were talking about that so you've got the failover clusters now with stateful failover. And clusters don't have to have every member running the same version of code. Just the mobility master has to have the newest one.
I think the cluster has to all be the same version of code. It's just the things connected to the mobility master don't necessarily need to be in the same version of code. Wasn't that?
Yeah, so you can have one cluster on this version of code and another cluster on that version of code.
Yeah, your clusters have to maintain the same code, but your mobility master can control multiple clusters of different versions. But that goes back to change management. You can easily test and roll out into different areas without having to do the entire network at once.
I think that's a huge draw of applications today. I mean, when's the last time Netflix went down on purpose?
Yeah, it's just
people just expect that now.
Well, and with the wireless has gotten important enough to the point where it's like you can't even do maintenance in the middle of the night because people are using the network somewhere. So it's just anything that we can do that prevents us from having to reboot controllers and reboot APs is a big win for everybody.
Awesome.
I'm glad Jake brought up the hospital thing because that's a pretty significant pain point. You just don't take down emergency rooms to do firmware updates. It just doesn't happen. It better be a pretty dramatic use case
And the preparation work you have to do to CYA for all of those things is not small.
Yep, and the windows are getting smaller and smaller because, like that mentioned, reliability on wireless today, especially in healthcare, it's critical. Just a couple days ago, a patient was having some issues and coded, and you kind of sit back and you watch how mobility plays itself out. Nurses getting phone calls, nurses calling other phones over Wi-Fi, the crash carts coming in. The windows are getting smaller and smaller, and the reliability is increasing.
Well, George, when's the last time you installed a medical device that had an Ethernet port on it?
Unfortunately, it still happens, but it's happening much less. I think the bigger problem that we have when we get sidetracked on that conversation is that a lot of those vendors come in with, a wireless option, has lots of zeros behind it, and you look in there, it's a little Soho NIC for $25, and it has its own issues, right? But to your point, we're seeing much more mobility. I mean, just in the last year, our client count has increased dramatically, about 5,000 clients over last year.
Richard.
Just going back on the reliability stance. So with the new mobility master, with the mobility master, if you do make a configuration change and it orphans out that controller that you've now broken, it'll revert back to the last change where it was able to talk to that mobility master. So you can actually do a lot of these changes and not have to worry about how do I get to Boise in the middle of the night to go bring that network back up. It's going to auto revert back to establish that connection back.
The big worry I have is talking about making it all virtualized is suddenly, our skill set needs to be a little more, data center virtualization, focused. And the other piece is from an architecture perspective. I mean, we put wireless at the edge, we put our controllers in the distribution layer. Are we really ready to bring all that wireless traffic back into my data center block of my network? I'm not so sure. So some of these things like the multi-zone kind of may be able to help us putting some physical controllers in place to help with that. But it's a huge architectural concern. CAM tables and switches and data center switches now matter. Your virtualization infrastructure is super important, and we know that we aren't the experts in that. So we have to trust the rest of those teams to make it work the way it needs to.
But I think one of the things that we are seeing, not just in wireless, but in networking in general, is that silo busting attitude of you guys can't just sit in your little server or your network closets and tell the world, well, I don't know how virtualization works. Well, now all your software is virtualized, and now you have to start working with those teams and breaking all those down. And I hate to say it, but you're going to have to be a full stack engineer if you want to make it much further. Now, one of the things I like about wireless is that no matter how full stack you guys get, there's still that we can't see the wire part on the other end that's really difficult to do if you're not really well trained in wireless. So that's that's a key point for you guys. So does anybody else have any other thoughts on OS 8.0 that they'd like to jump in with real quick?
Clarity, being able to take a radio and connect it to another radio and be able to test maybe iPerf or DHCP or DNS to give you kind of that end-to-end, is everything working? Is it a Wi-Fi problem? Because that kind of seems to be the issue. I can't get DHCP, but really it's a DHCP issue, not a Wi-Fi issue. So we now have the ability in the Aruba platform to kind of find where the issue is and alert the correct team or correct the problem yourself.
What I like best about the clarity is not so much necessarily we're going to be troubleshooting one particular thing, because that's nice. That is nice to have, but I think potentially the more valuable thing there is the fact that it's creating a baseline, so you know what the network looks like under normal circumstances, and you can see when something changed more easily because you have this historical record of how things changed. So then you can tie that with a change control or with something else that happened, which will shorten the troubleshooting even more. Instead of just saying this thing is obviously broken, that kind of information helps find things that are more subtly broken.
And the history part of it, they're building into this platform is great. With Air Match, they're now going to use the whole, like a day's worth of data to make those channel decisions and the power decisions instead of making those your scanning intervals. They'll still do the emergency fixes on the air if they need to, but they're taking a holistic approach to what was the best Wi-Fi scenario for the day, and let's apply that to tomorrow, and they'll keep doing that, and that's really good.
I like the fact that we have some horsepower behind it now. We're no longer, I have to buy the giant controller just to get the effectiveness of that one thing. I have a x86 server that I'm putting a VM on, and I got all kinds of resources available. Spin it up and let it crunch those numbers all the time.
I think George has some thoughts here.
Yeah, when you're managing a large wireless network, or any network for that matter, but especially a large wireless network, to be proactive, wow, game changer, right? I mean, dedicate resources to look at issues, potential issues, get in front of them. Because a lot of times you see that one problem, you think, it's not that bad, but you don't realize maybe there's 20, 30 people that are dealing with it. But they aren't barking, right? They aren't opening tickets. They're not complaining. So being proactive, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I think honestly that was one of the things that when I talked to Aruba folks about OS 8.0 and some of the things that are coming in it is that ability to get in front of problems before they happen. Because let's face it, wireless doesn't drop when you're staring at it. It drops when you turn your back and you're looking at another problem. And then, of course, it's always the wireless network's fault. It's never DHCP, it's never DNS, although it's always DHCP or DNS. And so we have to spend all of our time justifying why the wireless isn't broken instead of actually fixing the problems. But I think as we get further down the road, that by having software tools that can help us do that part of the job more easily, it helps us do our jobs better so that we can concentrate on making the user experience that much better. And really, I hope that that's what you take away from this discussion around Aruba OS 8, is that all of the features that have been included in this release are designed to make your life easier so you can make users' lives easier, and that means much easier lifetime at work.